She dies in Washington on an April night, pneumonia in her lungs, creditors at the door, and the most infamous blue diamond on earth locked away like evidence. But for decades, Evalyn Walsh McLean wore the Hope Diamond like a dare, a 45.52 carat bruise of light that was supposed to punish whoever touched it. In public, she hosted senators, moguls, and royalty in rooms bright with champagne and orchids. In private, the fortune cracked. A child was taken by the road. Her marriage collapsed into institutions and lawyers, and the curse became the only story polite society was willing to repeat. The girl who learned to perform. Before the diamond, she learned the first rule of old money survival: never show fear, only shine. Evalyn Walsh was born in 1886 into a world where dirt could turn into diamonds if you knew where to dig. Her father, Thomas Walsh, was an Irish immigrant who struck gold in Colorado when she was still learning to walk. The Camp Bird mine produced $17 million worth of ore before he sold it, and that number needs context. 17 million in 1900 translates to over 600 million today. The family went from frontier prospectors to Washington society in less than a decade, the kind of vertical leap that leaves cracks in the foundation nobody wants to examine. Thomas bought a mansion at 2021 Massachusetts Avenue. He filled it with European paintings, silk wallpaper from France, and a 60-foot ballroom where presidents came to drink his whiskey. Evelyn grew up watching her father spend like a man who believed the vein would never run dry. She learned that wealth was not just about having money, it was about performing it. The parties had to be brighter, the jewels larger, the guest list more impossible to penetrate. In that world, restraint was indistinguishable from poverty. By the time she was a teenager, Evelyn understood the rules. You did not talk about the mine or the mud. You talked about Paris, about Newport, about which ambassador said what at dinner. She was sent to boarding schools where the daughters of senators and railroad barons learned to move through rooms like they owned the air itself. But there was something restless in her, something that resisted the careful choreography of debutante life. She rode horses too fast. She drove cars when women were not supposed to drive at all. In 1906, she crashed an automobile in Newport and walked away with scars she would carry for life. The accident should have been a warning. Instead, it became part of her mythology, proof that she could break the rules and survive. She was pretty in the way that money makes pretty, with dark hair, pale skin, and eyes that photographers loved because they looked like they were daring you to look away. Her father had built an empire on instinct and luck. Evelyn inherited the instinct, but mistook recklessness for luck. She believed that if you spent loud enough, lived bright enough, the universe would bend to match your confidence. It was a philosophy that works until it does not, and by the time it stops working, you are too deep in the performance to quit. In Washington in the early 1900s was a city built on gossip and proximity to power. Fortunes were not just made in mining or railroads. They were made in who you knew, what you whispered, and how often your name appeared in the society pages. Evelyn's parents had bought their way into that world, but she wanted to own it. The McLean family would give her that chance, along with everything else that came with it, the marriage that came with a fuse. She did not just marry a man, she married a newspaper empire and a drinking problem. Edward Beale McLean was the son of John Roll McLean, who owned the Washington Post and the Cincinnati Enquirer. The family fortune was estimated at $100 million, built on ink, influence, and the kind of political access that turns elections into suggestions. When Evalyn Walsh met Edward in 1908, It was not love at first sight. It was recognition. They were both children of new money, trying to live like old aristocracy, both reckless, both convinced that consequences were for people with smaller bank accounts. They married in 1909 at her father's mansion, and the wedding was designed to stop traffic. The ceremony cost $200,000, equivalent to nearly $7 million today. There were orchids shipped from Ecuador, champagne from France, and a guest list that read like a congressional roll call. The bride wore a tiara that cost more than most houses. The groom was already drunk. Edward drank the way some men gamble, compulsively, joylessly, as if trying to fill a hole that kept getting wider. His father had given him money and access, but no structure, no purpose beyond spending and appearing at the right parties. Evelyn matched him drink for drink in the early years. They traveled to Europe, bought estates, threw parties that lasted until dawn. They were famous for their excess, which is another way of saying they were famous for not knowing when to stop. The post was their inheritance and their weapon. Edward's family controlled what Washington read every morning, which meant they controlled the narrative around their own lives. When the gossip got too sharp, they could redirect it. When rivals circled, they could deploy editorials like artillery. The marriage was not just romantic. It was a merger of two fortunes, two egos, and two appetites that fed off each other until there was nothing left to consume but themselves. They had a son, Vincent, in 1909. Fatherhood did not slow Edward down. If anything, it made him worse, as if the responsibility clarified how unprepared he was for responsibility. Evelyn threw herself into motherhood the way she did everything else, with intensity and little patience for anything that suggested limits. She wanted to be the kind of mother who gave her children everything, which often meant giving them everything except stability. Money was their solution to every problem. If Edward drank too much, they would throw a bigger party to distract from it. If the marriage felt hollow, they would buy another estate. If boredom crept in, they would go to Paris or Monte Carlo and spend until the boredom transformed into exhaustion. It was a strategy that required constant escalation, and by 1910, they were already looking for the next spectacle. The Hope Diamond was not a purchase. It was an inevitability. The diamond that wanted a story. On a January day, the Hope Diamond changes hands, and the sale comes with a threat disguised as fine print. Pierre Cartier was a jeweler who understood that rich women did not buy stones. They bought stories. In January 1911, he walked into Evalyn McLean's life, carrying a 45.52-carat blue diamond with a reputation soaked in blood, madness, and royalty. The stone had supposedly belonged to Louis XVI before the guillotine. It had passed through the hands of a sultan whose empire collapsed, a British collector who died in debt, and a string of owners who met violent or tragic ends. Cartier did not downplay the curse. He marketed it. The asking price was $180,000 and close to $6 million in modern currency. For context, that was enough to buy 30 houses in a good Washington neighborhood or fund a Senate campaign with money left over. Evelyn hesitated for exactly one afternoon. Then she said yes, not in spite of the curse, but because of it. She believed that wearing something dangerous made you dangerous, that proximity to myth elevated you into myth. The diamond itself was almost alive in certain light, a deep sapphire blue that seemed to hold its own weather system, clouds and storms frozen inside the crystal. It was set in a necklace surrounded by white diamonds, 44.5 carats of supporting cast, designed to make the hope look even larger than it already was. When Evelyn wore it, people stopped mid-sentence. The stone demanded attention the way fire demands attention, into beautiful and vaguely threatening. Cartier delivered the curse with the receipt. He told her about Marie Antoinette, about the jeweler who brought it to France and died bankrupt, about every tragedy that seemed to follow the stone like a shadow. Some of it was true. Most of it was marketing. But Evelyn did not care about accuracy. She cared about impact. The curse made her interesting in a way that money alone could not. It gave her a narrative, a reason for people to remember her name after the party ended. She wore the diamond everywhere, to the opera, to dinners at the White House, to horse races and garden parties. She let her son Vincent play with it, dangling it in front of him like a toy, as if daring fate to prove itself. Friends warned her, spiritualists sent letters, the press wrote breathless columns about her audacity. Every warning made her wear it more often, because the performance required an audience, and controversy was just another form of attention. The purchase coincided with the height of their wealth and the beginning of its unraveling, though no one could see that yet. Edward's drinking was getting worse. Vincent was growing up in a house where servants outnumbered parents. The Post was powerful, but also expensive, a machine that required constant feeding. But in 1911, none of that mattered because Evalyn Walsh McLean had just bought the most famous cursed object in the world, and she was wearing it like armor. She believed she was too rich, too modern, too American to be touched by old-world superstition. She believed that bad luck was something that happened to people who did not have enough money to outrun it. She was wrong, but it would take years for the bill to come due, and by then, the curse would be the least of her problems. She turned grief into jewelry. The first tragedy is small enough to whisper about until it becomes too large to hide. Vincent Walsh McLean was 9 years old when a car struck him on a summer road in 1919. He had been playing near their estate, Friendship, a 100-acre property in Washington where the lawns stretched far enough that a child could disappear into the green and no one would notice for minutes at a time. The driver was a neighbor. The impact threw the boy several feet. He died before the ambulance arrived. The details matter because they are ordinary. There was no mysterious assailant, no supernatural intervention. A child ran into a road. A car did not stop in time. Now, it was the kind of accident that happens when money buys space, but not supervision. When staff manage property, but parents manage appearances. Evelyn was hosting a garden party when it happened. She was wearing the Hope Diamond. The press coverage was immediate and ravenous. Every newspaper in Washington ran the story, and most of them mentioned the diamond within the first 3 paragraphs. The curse was no longer a cocktail party anecdote. It was a diagnosis, a way to explain the inexplicable without blaming the living. Columnists wrote that the stone had claimed its first victim in the McLean family. Mediums offered to cleanse the jewel. Letters poured in from strangers, equal parts sympathy and warning. Evelyn did not take the diamond off. If anything, she wore it more defiantly, as if refusing to let grief or gossip dictate her behavior. She held a funeral that looked like a state event, with senators and cabinet members filling the pews, flowers stacked so high they blocked the altar. She stood at the grave in black silk and sapphire fire, a mother in mourning who would not give the world the satisfaction of seeing her break. But privately, the fracture was total. Edward's drinking, which had been bad, became catastrophic. He disappeared for days at a time, returning to friendship incoherent or not at all. Evelyn turned to morphine, prescribed by doctors who understood that wealthy women did not have addiction problems. They had nerves. The drug was legal, accessible, and socially acceptable as long as you called it medicine. She took it to sleep, to wake up, and to endure the parties she still insisted on hosting because stopping would mean admitting something had changed. The estate became a kind of mausoleum where the living performed normalcy. Staff maintained the gardens. Dinners were served on schedule. Evelyn appeared in the society pages, always photographed, always jeweled, always described as gracious or resilient, or some other word that meant, "We will not ask what is really happening." The diamond became a convenient scapegoat, a way for Washington to gossip about tragedy without acknowledging the more uncomfortable truths. That wealth does not prevent loss. That mansions are just houses where people still die. That a mother's pain is not lessened by the size of her bank account. The curse narrative took hold because it was simpler than the alternative. If the diamond was haunted, then Vincent's death was fate, not negligence. If a supernatural force was at work, then no one had to examine the household, the marriage, the choices that put a 9-year-old boy near a road with no one watching. The myth protected everyone except Evelyn, who was left holding both the grief and the object everyone wanted to blame. She kept the diamond because selling it would look like surrender. She kept it because it had become part of her identity, inseparable from her public image. And maybe, in some quiet moment she would never admit to anyone, she kept it because having a curse was easier than admitting she had failed to protect her son. The stone became a shield, a story that let her avoid the harder story underneath. The cure that became a cover. When the parties kept going, it looked like strength, and that is exactly why it worked. Friendship became famous for its excess in the 1920s. Evelyn hosted senators, foreign dignitaries, Hollywood stars, and anyone else whose presence could fill the void left by her son. The parties were not celebrations, they were construction projects, elaborate scaffolding designed to hold up a woman who was collapsing from the inside. She spent an estimated $50,000 per year on entertaining alone, nearly $800,000 in today's currency. The champagne flowed, the orchestras played, and Evelyn moved through the rooms wearing the hope diamond like a spotlight that kept everyone from looking too closely at her eyes. The morphine use was an open secret among her inner circle. Doctors prescribed it freely, a common treatment for everything from insomnia to hysteria, which was the medical term for any emotional state that made men uncomfortable. Evelyn took it in liquid form, measured doses that stopped being measured as tolerance built and need overtook caution. She called it her medicine. Her friends called it her cure. The press never called it anything because you did not write about a society matron's private struggles, especially when her husband owned one of the most influential newspapers in the capital. Edward's condition was harder to hide. He was institutionalized multiple times throughout the 20s, committed to private sanatoriums where the wealthy sent family members who drank too much, spent too much, or simply embarrassed them too publicly. The Washington Post described these absences as rest cures or extended vacations. The truth was that Edward Beale McLean was disintegrating, and no amount of money could hold him together. His father's empire was slipping through his fingers, managed by trustees and lawyers who understood that the heir was no longer capable of managing anything, including himself. The couple had more children. Evalyn Jr., born in 1915, and another son, John, in 1918. They grew up in a house where the ballroom was always full and the parents were always absent, physically present but emotionally evacuated. Staff raised them. Tutors educated them. Evalyn appeared for photographs, always immaculate, always draped in jewels that cost more than the annual salary of everyone in the room combined. The Hope Diamond remained her signature, the prop that turned every appearance into theater. The spending was pathological by this point. The household staff at Friendship numbered over 75 people. There were 12 cars in the garage, including a custom Rolls-Royce with gold-plated fixtures. The estate required $150,000 per year to maintain, equivalent to $2.4 million today. The Post was profitable, but not infinitely so, and Edward's mismanagement meant that revenue was shrinking while expenses multiplied. Trustees began warning Evalyn that the money was not endless, that the fortune required stewardship, not spectacle. She ignored them. Stopping would mean admitting the party was over, and she had built her entire identity on the idea that the party never ended. The curse narrative served her well during this period. When people asked why she looked tired, why Edward was absent, why the children seemed more attached to their nannies than their mother, she could gesture to the diamond and let the myth do the explaining. The stone became her alibi, a supernatural explanation for failures that were profoundly human. It allowed her to be tragic instead of culpable, cursed instead of addicted, victimized by fate instead of undone by her own choices, and the unexamined trauma of losing a child in a moment of distraction. Washington society played along because the alternative was uncomfortable. Wealth was supposed to insulate you from suffering. If Evalyn McLean, with her mansion and her diamonds and her newspaper empire, could not buy happiness, then what was the point of ambition? Better to blame the jewel. On to turn her story into a cautionary tale about cursed objects rather than an honest examination of how money amplifies dysfunction instead of solving it. The myth was kinder than the truth, and Evalyn, whatever her flaws, understood the value of a good story. He was declared the problem. She found the only weapon society would accept in a wealthy marriage war: declare him unfit. By 1930, the McLean marriage had become a legal matter, not a romantic one. Edward was living in psychiatric institutions more than he was living at home, cycled through sanitariums in Virginia, New York, and Maryland, as doctors attempted treatments that ranged from rest to sedation to experimental therapies that mostly involved keeping him away from alcohol and the public. Evalyn, meanwhile, was petitioning courts to take control of his estate, arguing that he was mentally incompetent and therefore incapable of managing the family finances. The legal strategy was brilliant in its brutality. In the 1930s, declaring someone insane was one of the few ways a woman could seize power in a marriage, especially a marriage where the husband controlled the assets. Evalyn hired the best lawyers money could buy and built a case that framed Edward as not just drunk, but delusional. She presented medical testimony, financial records showing reckless spending, and affidavits from staff who described erratic behavior. The subtext was clear. He was the problem, not the household, not the lifestyle, not the shared decades of unchecked excess. Edward fought back, or at least his lawyers did, arguing that Evalyn was equally unstable, equally reckless, and that her morphine use made her just as unfit to control the fortune. Court documents from the era describe a marriage that had become mutual destruction, each side weaponizing the other's addictions, each accusing the other of squandering money while simultaneously demanding more of it. The Post, once their shared weapon, was now a liability, hemorrhaging money as the Depression eroded advertising revenue, and Edward's reputation made it harder to attract serious journalists. The estate went into receivership in 1933. A panel of trustees took control of the McLean family finances, with Evelyn granted an allowance of $75,000 per year for personal expenses, roughly $1.6 million today. It sounds like a fortune until you consider that she had been spending 3 times that amount annually, and her entire identity was built on spending without limits. The allowance was a leash, a public acknowledgement that the money had finally said no. Edward was committed permanently to a psychiatric hospital in Towson, Maryland in 1933. He would remain there until his death in 1941, rarely visited by his wife, increasingly forgotten by the society that had once celebrated him as a Prince of Washington. He was 47 years old when they locked him away, technically alive but functionally erased. A cautionary tale about what happens when inheritance meets instability and no one intervenes until it is too late. Their daughter, Evelyn Jr., was 18 when her father disappeared into the institution. She had grown up watching her parents destroy each other in slow motion, the parties masking the decay, the jewels distracting from the hollowness underneath. She would learn the same lessons her mother learned, that money could buy almost anything except stability. That spectacle was a poor substitute for structure, and that when the performance finally collapsed, no one would remember the moments of beauty, only the wreckage. The Hope Diamond remained. Evelyn wore it through the court battles, the custody fights, the trustee meetings where men in suits explained to her that she could no longer afford to live the way she had been living. The curse had become a convenient explanation for all of it: the failed marriage, the institutionalized husband, the fortune slipping through her fingers. But the reality was simpler and sadder. 2 people with too much money and too little purpose had built a life on performance, and when the performance required more than they could give, it collapsed. The diamond did not cause the ruin. It just gave them something to look at while it happened. The Lindbergh con man smelled blood. In the country's most famous kidnapping, a grifter walks straight into her salon and names a price for hope. On March 1st, 1932, the Lindbergh baby was taken from his crib in New Jersey. The news shattered America. Charles Lindbergh was a national hero, the pilot who had conquered the Atlantic, and the idea that even his child was not safe made every parent in the country re-examine their locks. Evalyn McLean, sitting in her mansion reading the papers, saw something else. She saw a mother's pain, and she recognized it. Gaston Means saw an opportunity. He was a convicted fraudster, a career criminal who had spent years perfecting the art of looking trustworthy to people who desperately wanted to believe him. He had connections in Washington, a persuasive voice, and the kind of confidence that comes from knowing that desperation makes people stupid. He contacted Evelyn a week after the kidnapping and told her he could get the baby back. He had connections with the kidnappers, he said. He could negotiate. All he needed was $100,000 in cash to facilitate the exchange. Evelyn believed him, or maybe she wanted to believe him so badly that skepticism felt like betrayal. She had lost a son. The Lindberghs had lost a son. In her mind, she was not being conned. She was doing what any mother would do, using her wealth to prevent another family from living through what she had lived through. She gathered the cash, a staggering sum equivalent to nearly $2 million today, and handed it to Gaston Means in her parlor at Friendship. He promised results within days. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The baby was found dead in May, a few miles from the Lindbergh home, killed shortly after the abduction. The ransom negotiations that Means had described were fiction. The connections were fantasy. The $100,000 disappeared into his pockets, spent on horses, gambling, and whatever else a con man buys when he has just pulled off one of the most audacious scams in American history. He had targeted Evelyn specifically because he knew she was rich, reckless, and emotionally vulnerable, a combination that made her the perfect mark. The trial was a public humiliation. Means was arrested, tried, and convicted of fraud in 1933. Evelyn testified, describing how she had been manipulated, how her grief had been weaponized, how the money had been handed over with nothing but Means's word as collateral. The press covered it as another chapter in the curse of the Hope Diamond, because that was easier than admitting that a wealthy, educated woman had been fooled by a two-bit criminal with a good suit and a plausible story. The narrative protected her dignity, even as it stripped her of agency, turning her into a victim of supernatural forces rather than a victim of her own poor judgment under stress. The $100,000 was never recovered. Means went to Leavenworth Penitentiary, where he died in 1938, taking the location of the money to his grave. Evelyn's reputation took a hit she could not afford. Washington had tolerated her eccentricity, her spending, her morphine use, but being publicly conned suggested something worse than addiction or grief. It suggested gullibility, a fatal flaw in a city where power depended on the perception of control. The trustees tightened their grip after the Lindbergh disaster. Evelyn's allowance was scrutinized. Her spending was monitored. She was told, repeatedly, that there were limits now, that the fortune was not infinite, that choices had consequences. She responded by wearing the Hope Diamond to every public appearance, as if the jewel itself could restore the aura of untouchability she had spent decades cultivating. It could not. The curse had become less of a myth and more of a self-fulfilling prophecy, not because the diamond was haunted, but because Evelyn kept making decisions that confirmed the worst predictions about her judgment. The daughter became the next omen. When her daughter is found dead, society chooses the same explanation again because it is the easiest. Evalyn Walsh McLean Jr. died on January 24, 1946. She was 25 years old. The official cause was an overdose of sleeping pills, taken in her apartment in Washington after a day that looked, to everyone who saw her, like any other day. There was no note, no warning, just a young woman who went to sleep and did not wake up, and a mother who had to bury a second child while wearing the diamond that everyone said had killed them both. The press called it the curse immediately. The Washington Post, once her family's empire, now just another newspaper covering her tragedies, and ran headlines that tied the death to the Hope Diamond. Columnists wrote about the pattern, the accumulation of loss, the way the stones seemed to devour the McLean family one member at a time. Spiritualists renewed their warnings. Strangers sent letters demanding Evelyn destroy the diamond before it took her too. The narrative was tidy, dramatic, and completely incurious about the actual circumstances of Evelyn Jr.'s life. She had grown up in chaos. Her father was institutionalized when she was a teenager. Her mother was absent even when present, medicated and distracted, and always performing for an audience that did not include her own children. Evelyn Jr. had married young to a man named Senator Reynolds, a union that dissolved quickly and publicly. She had struggled with depression, with purposelessness, with the specific kind of emptiness that comes from being raised in a mansion where money substitutes for attention and jewels substitute for love. The sleeping pills were prescribed. Access was easy. Dosage was a guess. And in the 1940s, overdose was a common enough tragedy that it barely warranted investigation unless there was scandal attached. The death was ruled accidental by some accounts, suicide by others, and cursed by the public. The verdict depended on who you asked and what story they needed to believe. For Evelyn, the distinction did not matter. Her daughter was gone, and the only explanation society was interested in was the one that involved a piece of jewelry. The funeral was smaller than Vincent's had been. Evelyn was 60 years old by then, and diminished by grief and morphine and the cumulative weight of decades spent performing strength she did not feel. She wore the Hope Diamond to the service because, at this point, it was less a choice and more a reflex. The stone was part of her identity, inseparable from her public image, and removing it would be an admission that the curse was real, which would mean admitting that everything she had told herself about control and fate was a lie. Friends who visited Friendship in the months after Evelyn Jr.'s death described a woman who had stopped pretending. The parties ended. The salons went dark. The staff continued to maintain the estate, but the mansion felt like a museum, preserved but lifeless. Evelyn moved through the rooms like a ghost, the diamond around her neck the only bright thing left. She was not suicidal, but she was not alive either, just waiting for the final act of a tragedy that had been written decades earlier. The curse narrative served a purpose here too. It allowed people to discuss her losses without examining the household that produced them. It let Washington gossip about tragedy without confronting the systemic failures that made that tragedy possible. The normalization of addiction among the wealthy, the lack of mental health resources, the way money isolated families instead of protecting them. The diamond became the villain, which meant no one else had to be. Not the doctors who prescribed morphine like candy. Not the trustees who controlled her money, but ignored her unraveling. Not Evelyn herself, who had built a life on spectacle and was now living in the ruins of that choice. Her daughter's death was the moment the curse stopped being glamorous and started being pathetic. Evelyn was no longer the daring heiress who defied superstition. She was a mother who had buried 2 children and was wearing the supposed murder weapon to their funerals. The performance had eaten itself. All that was left was the prop and the pain. The fortune finally said no. There is a moment when even old money stops returning your calls, and she hits it head on. By 1947, the McLean fortune existed mostly on paper. Friendship was mortgaged. The Post had been sold to Eugene Meyer in 1933 for $850,000, a fire sale price for a newspaper that had once been worth tens of millions. The trustees had liquidated assets for years, selling properties, stocks, on anything that could be converted to cash to cover debts, taxes, and the endless expenses of maintaining an estate that required a staff of 70 just to keep the lights on. Evelyn's personal debt was estimated at over $300,000, roughly $5 million in today's currency. She owed money to jewelers, creditors, staff who had gone unpaid for months. The Hope Diamond, once a symbol of invincibility, was now collateral, held by lenders who understood that its value was more theoretical than liquid. Cursed jewels are hard to sell, especially when the curse is public knowledge and the most recent owner has buried 2 children while wearing it. The estate was costing $120,000 per year to maintain by the mid-1940s. Evelyn's allowance from the trustees, once $75,000 annually, had been cut to $30,000 as the remaining assets dwindled. She was spending 4 times her income, a trick that works for a while if you have enough credit, but eventually the creditors want their money, and eventually the trustees stop believing that next year will be different. The math was brutal and simple. She was running out of everything except the illusion of wealth. Friendship began to decay. Rooms were closed off to save on heating. Staff were laid off. The gardens, once immaculate, grew wild. Visitors described a mansion that felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by the memory of what it had been. The parties that would never happen again. The champagne that would never flow. Evelyn stopped hosting. She stopped appearing in the society pages. The woman who had built her identity on being seen became invisible, not by choice, but by necessity. No one wants to attend a party at a house that smells like financial ruin. The jewelry collection was all she had left, and even that was entangled in legal disputes. The trustees argued that the jewels were part of the estate, subject to creditor claims. Evelyn argued that they were personal property, gifts from her father and her husband, not assets to be liquidated. The court sided with the creditors. The diamonds, the emeralds, the sapphires that had once made her the envy of Washington were now listed in bankruptcy filings, appraised and photographed and tagged like evidence. The Hope diamond remained hers, technically, but only because no buyer had emerged. The curse had done its job. Who wanted a 45.52 carat reminder of death, madness, and financial collapse? Evelyn tried to sell it quietly in 1946, approaching jewelers with discretion and desperation. The offers were insultingly low, a fraction of the $180,000 she had paid in 1911. She refused them all, not out of pride, but because selling the diamond would be an admission that everything it represented, the glamour, the defiance, the performance, had been a lie. Her health was failing by then. The morphine had ruined her kidneys. The stress had ruined her heart. She was 61 years old and looked 80, diminished and exhausted, and still clinging to the last prop in a show that had closed years ago. Friends who visited in the spring of 1947 described a woman who spoke as if the fortune still existed, as if the parties might resume, as if the past 30 years had been a temporary setback rather than a permanent collapse. Delusion was kinder than clarity. The trustees prepared for her death the way executors prepare for an estate sale. They inventoried the jewelry. They appraised the property. They calculated debts and projected sale prices and tried to determine if there would be anything left for the heirs after the creditors took their share. The answer was no. The McLean fortune, once measured in the tens of millions, would die with Evelyn, liquidated to pay for the decades of spending that had looked like power, but was really just gravity waiting for its turn. Pneumonia, debt, and a locked box. At the end, there is no ballroom, only a sick bed, and people arguing over what she really left behind. Evalyn Walsh McLean died on April 26, 1947, in Washington, in a hospital bed, with pneumonia filling her lungs and lawyers filling the hallway outside. She was 61. The Hope diamond was not with her. It was locked in a vault at a bank, held as collateral against debts she would never repay. The woman who had spent decades wearing the cursed jewel as armor died without it, reduced to flesh and failure, and the kind of quiet ending that does not make headlines. The obituaries were generous in the way that obituaries for the wealthy always are. They mentioned her father's gold mine, her marriage to the post heir, the salons at Friendship where presidents and senators once drank her champagne. They mentioned the Hope Diamond and the curse, because the curse was the only story about her that people still wanted to hear. They did not mention the morphine, the debts, the daughter who died of sleeping pills, or the husband who spent his last years in a psychiatric ward. Those details were considered indelicate, private matters that died with the deceased. The estate was chaos. The trustees had been preparing for this moment for years, but preparation did not make it simpler. The jewelry collection alone required weeks to catalog. There were over 60 pieces, diamonds and emeralds and sapphires and pearls, each entangled in legal claims from creditors who believed they had first rights to the stones. The Hope Diamond was the centerpiece, appraised at $150,000, less than she had paid for it 36 years earlier. Curses, it turned out, depreciate value faster than they appreciate mythology. Friendship was mortgaged to the point of unsalvageable debt. The estate sold for a fraction of its worth, the house eventually subdivided and demolished, the 100 acres carved up into lots for developers who built homes for families who would never know that senators once danced on this land. The ballroom where Evelyn had hosted America's elite became a memory, then a footnote, then nothing at all. Buildings die faster than reputations. Her son, John, inherited the debts and the legal battles. The trustees explained to him that his mother's estate was insolvent, that the jewels would be sold to pay creditors, that there was no fortune left, only the ghost of one. He was 29 years old, raised in wealth he could not sustain, and now tasked with dismantling what remained of his mother's legacy. The Hope Diamond became his problem, a 45.52 carat question mark that no one wanted to buy and everyone wanted to blame. The final inventory listed $320,000 in debts against assets valued at $200,000. The math was simple. The McLean fortune, which had peaked at over $100 million in the 1920s, died $120,000 in the red. Adjusting for inflation makes it worse. Evelyn had burned through the equivalent of over $1 billion in her lifetime, spending it on parties, jewels, morphine, legal battles, and the relentless upkeep of a performance that required more capital than the earth could produce. The curse debate intensified after her death. Spiritualists claimed vindication. Skeptics pointed to addiction and poor financial management. The press split the difference, writing articles that presented both perspectives and let readers choose their own narrative. But the truth was simpler than either side wanted to admit. Evalyn Walsh McLean was not killed by a diamond. She was killed by a lifetime of using money as a substitute for meaning, spectacle as a substitute for connection, and mythology as a substitute for accountability. The stone was just an expensive prop in a tragedy that would have unfolded with or without it. The King of Diamonds takes the evidence. The curse does not end with a funeral. It ends with a transaction. Harry Winston was the most famous jeweler in America by 1949, a man who dealt in stones the way other men dealt in real estate, moving millions of dollars worth of gems across continents with the casual efficiency of someone who understood that diamonds, curses, or not, were ultimately just inventory. He bought the entire McLean jewelry collection for $1 million, a bulk purchase that included the Hope Diamond, 63 other pieces, and the legal headaches that came with all of them. $1 million sounds like a fortune until you break it down. Winston was paying roughly $16,000 per piece on average, and while the Hope diamond accounted for a significant portion of the value, he was essentially getting a discount for buying in volume and accepting the baggage. The curse was part of the baggage. He did not care. Winston understood that controversy sold, that people would pay more for a stone with a story than a stone with just carats, and the Hope diamond had the best story in the business: royalty, madness, death, and an American heiress who wore it while her life collapsed. He displayed the diamond in his New York showroom, where it became a tourist attraction. Thousands of people lined up to see it, pressing their faces against the glass, taking photographs, whispering about the curse while standing in a room filled with security guards and insurance policies. Winston treated it like theater, which is what Evelyn would have wanted. He loaned it to museums, exhibited it at charity events, and generally turned the Hope diamond into a traveling exhibition that generated more publicity than profit. He was not trying to sell it. He was using it to sell everything else. In 1958, Winston made a decision that transformed the diamond from private property into national monument. He donated the Hope diamond to the Smithsonian Institution, sending it via registered mail in a plain brown package insured for $1 million. The postage cost $2.44. That detail matters because it reveals the gap between myth and reality. The most cursed jewel in history, worth $1 million, sent through the United States Postal Service like a birthday present to a distant relative. The Smithsonian accepted it without ceremony. The diamond arrived, was unpacked by curators wearing gloves, and placed in the National Museum of Natural History, where it remains today behind bulletproof glass in a room that sees 7 million visitors per year. It is the most viewed object in the museum, more popular than dinosaur bones or moon rocks or any of the other wonders that America has decided belong to everyone. The curse, once a private burden, became a public attraction. The insurance value of $1 million in 1958 translates to roughly $10 million today, but the diamond's cultural value is incalculable. It has appeared in films, books, documentaries, and conspiracy theories. It has been blamed for deaths that happened after it left the McLean family, a recursive mythology that feeds itself with every new tragedy that can plausibly be linked to anyone who ever touched it. The Smithsonian does not endorse the curse, but they do not deny it either. They present the history, the chemistry, the provenance, and let visitors decide what to believe. When Harry Winston died in 1978, wealthy and respected, his reputation untouched by the supposed curse. The postman who delivered the diamond to the Smithsonian lived another 20 years, unremarkably with no reported tragedies. The curators who handle it wear gloves, but only because gloves protect the stone, not the handler. The curse, if it ever existed, seems to have been deactivated by bureaucracy, neutralized by the conversion of private myth into public property. Evelyn would have hated the ending. She spent decades making the diamond synonymous with her name, and within a decade of her death, it belonged to everyone and no one. The stone outlived its owner, outlasted its mythology, and ended up in a museum where school children press their noses to the glass and ask their parents if the curse is real. The parents say no, but they say it quietly, just in case. The curse was the story they preferred. The diamond never needed to kill her. It only needed to give everyone permission to look away. The Hope diamond sits in the Smithsonian today, rotating slowly on a pedestal under lights designed to make the blue seem deeper, more alive, more like the dangerous thing people want it to be. 7 million people visit it every year. Most of them know the curse. Fewer know Evelyn's name. Almost none know about the morphine, the institutionalized husband, the $100,000 lost to a con man, or the daughter who died with a bottle of sleeping pills on her nightstand. The curse is easier to remember than the woman who wore it. This is the function of curses in wealthy families. They provide narrative cover for failures that are too uncomfortable to name directly. If the Hope Diamond killed Evelyn's son, then no one has to ask why a 9-year-old was playing near a road without supervision. If the diamond drove her husband mad, then no one examines the alcoholism that started before the purchase. If the diamond cursed her daughter, then no one discusses the depression, the failed marriage, the childhood spent in a house where money substituted for parenting. The supernatural explanation is a mercy, a way to grieve without assigning blame, to gossip without accountability. Evalyn Walsh McLean was not a victim of a cursed jewel. She was a victim of inheritance without purpose, wealth without structure, and a culture that valued performance over honesty. She was born into a fortune that her father built through luck and instinct, married into a fortune that was already rotting from the inside, and spent her life trying to prove that she was as invincible as her bank account suggested. The diamond was not the problem. The diamond was the distraction. The real curse was simpler and sadder. The belief that money could solve grief, that spectacle could replace meaning, that if you spent loud enough and shined bright enough, the emptiness underneath would never show. She wore the Hope Diamond like armor, but armor is heavy, and she carried it for 36 years until it crushed her under its weight, not because it was haunted, but because it was never meant to protect her from the things that actually hurt. Washington society moved on quickly. The people who had attended her parties, drunk her champagne, and gossiped about her tragedies found new salons, new scandals, new reasons to gather and judge. Friendship was demolished. The Post changed hands and eventually became one of the most respected newspapers in America. Its connection to the McLean family reduced to a historical footnote. Edward died in the psychiatric hospital, forgotten. Vincent and Evelyn Jr. were buried, mourned briefly, and then absorbed into the larger mythology of the curse. Only the diamond remained, outlasting everyone who touched it, exactly as curses are supposed to do. The question that haunts the story is not whether the curse was real. The question is why we needed it to be real. Why is a haunted jewel a more satisfying explanation than addiction, neglect, and the slow erosion of a family under the weight of its own contradictions? See, why do we prefer supernatural punishment to human failure? The answer is that curses are dramatic, and human mistakes are boring. Curses make good stories. Depression, morphine dependence, and poor judgment make uncomfortable truths. Evelyn spent her life believing she was special, that her wealth made her exempt from the rules that governed ordinary people. She was wrong, but the wrongness took decades to prove, and by the time it was obvious, she had built an identity so dependent on the illusion that dismantling it would have meant dismantling herself. The diamond gave her a story to tell when the truth became unbearable. It gave her something to blame when the parties ended and the children died and the fortune evaporated and all that was left was a woman in a hospital bed with pneumonia and debt and a jewel locked in a vault she would never see again. The Hope Diamond is not cursed, but it is evidence. Evidence of what happens when money becomes myth, when performance replaces intimacy, when a society decides that spectacle is more important than honesty. Evalyn Walsh McLean wore the curse because it was easier than wearing the truth, and the world let her because the curse was more entertaining. The diamond did not kill her. It just gave everyone permission to look away while she killed herself.